the takings as a form of extortion from Ted Cruz's character's position, with the intention on using special categories in order to not pay the fair takings price for those delivered services or compelled takings of property, which the government, having seized, acknowledged in the registered position as having received the registered, approved, certified version of both the companies and of the contract schedules and projected earnings, as well as the development inherent to the maturing of the properties, and thus the takings of the human decency for the point of diminishing the human decency and status in order to diminish David Bowles from being the patriarchy, which is fundamental to that action as an act of bad faith, as they, in their Confederate conspiracy in treason against the United States, have conducted the subversion by infiltration of the office for the purposes of destruction of their office and the collapsing of its authorities, that they could sell it to adversaries in the right of conquest, would, in all means, sense, and understandings, to qualify as bad faith. Therefore, it could be understood that any one that they would seek to apply to defend against the function of the enforcement of the laws in the restorations, in the case of David Bowles, with the pursuit of the remedy being blocked by these obstructions, must have the suit for the right of the pursuit of the remedy. This then requires them to correct against the coercion inherent to the function of having blocked the right to the pursuit, and therefore the point of the exhaustion is the prevention of the money speech essential to paying for and filing all of the paperwork and living off of everything in order to amplify the potentials of broken glass war violations of law by poverty, which then are generated as a entrapment scheme from the restraints of lawful property and resources which the government is liable for, which by definition is the liability of the government and not of their victims. Whereas the government, having seized it, had not conducted its proper responsibilities in systematic acts of gross negligence, having allowed for the sedition to refuse the enforcement of the obligations or duties of the government, and therefore the dereliction of duty by the president, refusing to execute the laws and the responsibilities of the office in the preservation of the constitutional republic, which they are in active rebellion against, is self-evident as an impeachable affair. To this end, the material continued extortion from those mechanisms, including the various abuses, specifically in the proximity to this, the outer perimeter of that arrangement, then materializes the ascension of the obligations of the mass arrests by the means of this impeachment for the insurrection in question, demanding the mass restoration by the means of force as the function of the rebellion, having seized and acquired secret or otherwise blood oaths or other kinds of oaths in order to form a loyalty in subversion of the Constitution by officers of the constitutional republic, would then amount to an act of insurrection, and the signing of this loyalty pledge in opposition to subvert their loyalty from exclusively subordination to the Constitution, being a disbarring offense, enforces the immediate impeachment and disposal of the bad faith actors. The intent to conspiracy, compact, contract, subversion, oath, or otherwise, in order to seek to defend, is aiding and giving comfort to the conspirators, is an act of aiding and abetting, is an act of treason, is an act of bad faith. Is a subversion disqualifying the right to access the office that they are in rebellion of from these breaches of the public need. Now, the criminal violation concerning the contract to slavery is not the false cleverness postured in the white supremacist arrangement in order to state the subcontracting to those who were assisting in such as the function of paying off a contract for bonds in court, and therefore the subversion in this case, having not actually existed, materially dissolves itself inherently as the postured position of their false arguments is fundamental to their insurrectionist bad faith, and therefore reliant heavily on the falsifying of records in the government, at which point the use of forgeries for the purposes of fraud is fundamental to their rebellious nature. To wit, the answer of the contract which was not accepted, there then dwells the obligation of the automation of the contract wages, as well as the function of the bonuses and benefits. In the case of David Bowles, that is $25.6 million an hour, and all of the other compounding effects, including bonuses owed according to the variation and fluctuations within inside the market, which was calculated several different ways, and the secret record, which should be able to be preserved and to be discovered, or to which point its destruction of the record would be held as evidence as the functional rebellion. But to the original source, the function was estimated by a character self-identified as Dave Rubin, who assumed the position from an insurrection which had actively targeted California to overthrow it, stating that if they just owe too much, then they, by definition, would not be doing necessary force in order to win, and if they sought to pay it, which would then cripple their advantages, which by definition is the subversion of necessary force for the express purposes of unnecessary force, which then nullifies the entire argument that they were aiming for. But since their objective is to defraud the government until they've overthrown it in their rebellion, those who are aiding and abetting the destruction of the state and of the country as a whole would not mind such tedious technicalities as an obvious thing. In the use of the surveillance restraints contracted by Lindsey Graham's human trafficking arrangement for the Confederate Rebellion, has the American obligation of paying the original status and human decency duties, which otherwise would have obligated them to allow for the contract schedule, which would have been actively incorporated with the resume justifying those wages, to which they would have actively sabotaged that contract schedule, including the educational contracts from the original arrangements, as they systematically replace it by the white supremacist communist centrally planned economy's outcome, which has its own inferior, non-fair price, in order to have collapsed the status in office for the purposes of the leveraging of their defamations and extortions over the United States, such as the withholding of essential pieces of information in acts of censorship, such as, but is not limited to, the restraints of the contract schedule for David's national news, which then would have been essential in the education of the general public, which would have actively influenced substantive changes into the vote, which then has substantive different recourses concerning the elected and the policies that are approved of by the education available to the general public as a criminal intention of that subversion, and all compounding effects and other diversities inherently understood in the function of conducting these actions essential materialize the obligation for them in the collapse of the status, according to the prohibition violation in the Constitution about the use of punishments without due process in order to collapse status or human decency as an extortion, which, having been restrained against the targets, then engage in the exhaustion, which then prevents the resources of the money speech essential to speak with the government, blocking the pursuit of the remedy, requiring the full restoration of the obstructed contracts, schedule, title, properties, resources, monies, and other, which would have been fundamental as a sober, educated answer from the faculties of the title inside of that title of the contract schedule, which is inside that title, taken on the objective of having understood it for the purposes of the projected wealth specifically connected to it, the status, respect, and others inherently connected to it, which then bars the pursuit of the remedy, which you must sue Congress in order for David's restoration to be applied for a sober, educated answer for his right of the pursuit of the remedy to have been viable or possible, including all of the subversions by the human trafficking of their falsifying of the paperwork, which in speeches and engagements which they would have otherwise considered for the purposes of defamation, coercion against association, for slander, and so forth, in order to leverage the advantages as the extortion in the barring and retaliation for the attempt to pursue the remedy. This includes the function of the exhaustions of all available resources, and as the contract schedule clearly states that David Bowles would have had a bank, and that bank would have issued a credit card, the use of the bonds from the things that they take in the human trafficking maintenance of the person for their various affairs is their use of their private accounts credit card for their private spending of the bond, which would have been in David's accounts, for the express obligation to have paid off that credit card according to the agreement, which they may or may not have read, which is irrelevant, as the objective of the insurrectionists was not to pay for the service, and therefore have the extended extortion of the prevention of the pursuit of the remedy as a direct side effect, making it too inconvenient to engage in the process, barring its possibility, of which they are fully liable, as their taking of the government equipment to use as an intelligence, rather a hostile intelligent non-state actor, taking state equipment or agents or tools, then becomes a violation of gross negligence by the state to have not maintained its properties adequately in order to have prevented it, similar to the function of when someone violates the Second Amendment by not properly securing their weapons in their private homes, properly allowing for their children or others to come in and engage in the arbitrary taking of that weapon, which then would cause harm to themselves or others or to others' property, which may include but not be limited to the killing of somebody else or major injury, which is the liability by the crime of gross negligence of the possessor of that weapon or tools, respectively. Among that, this then appears according to the obstructed contract schedule's observance of the standing understanding of the law would require those who took the violation equipment in order to conduct the abuse to owe federal debts to the federal government, which is liable to pay the gross negligence fees of the entirety of those amounts as they take or extort the resources out of the violators who, having conducted the violation, earned the possession of federal debts that they are liable to pay, like the function of federal student loan debts, which is not escapable and may not be pardoned. Likewise, the various abuses and extortions derived, such as the starvation or injury by the misuse of the resources, which might have the communist agenda of their religion of starvation to create a series of uncomfortable conditions which may be inconvenience, may be viewed as an extortion or coercion against the pursuit of the remedy as a retaliation for the attempt to have pursued the remedy, and therefore is a fully compensatable offense, and therefore the federal government is fully liable according to its various agreements in the deposit and restoration from that arrangement, which they are bound by law according to that concept in these violations to pay in its entirety as quickly as humanly possible, as the function of the targeting from the sedition has the intention to collapse the United States federal and state governments. It is a direct act of war or treason threatening national security, which makes all interest in the functions of the United States national security have to put off all competing issues to the side as the preeminent national security issue or affair in David Bull's restoration, as the function of having taken it from him in the first place had the objective of crippling the essential patriarchy or aristocracy to the national security, and therefore systematically purging each aspect of the essential protections of the federal government from the planned attack, making the artificial injuries available for the fatal attack upon the scheduled date, which includes but is not limited to the forgeries by the fake Congress or the anti-Congress or the voter frauds elected, which then materialize the exponential debts from, of, and to the government, which includes the crippling amount of federal debts that the federal government owes, which has an interest rate which generates $1 trillion of extra debt from the interest alone. $1 trillion every 100 days is a real national security threat, which these white trash Confederates have actively put us in, which fundamentally was one of the premier justifications to these seditions and coercions and retaliations against David Bull's right to the pursuit of the remedy for the express purposes of protecting those injuries, 9/11 and many others, which in most cases would still be classified, materialize the obligation at the highest issues to sue for David Bull's right to pursue in its full restoration, allowing for the ability to be at least vaguely possible for national security to exist with the existence of the United States or its people, which would have otherwise been completely eradicated in absence of David Bull's by these coercions against the pursuit and other fundamental rights owed to all citizens. Extortions include but are not limited to the function of falsified records claiming to be experiments or otherwise in direct violation of the constitutional law, which was supported by the white supremacist rebellion in their series of compounding judicial activisms as a function of weaponizing the tools of the military against the civilian population as a weapon of war for the purposes of overthrowing the civilian government, and therefore an act of insurrection, and therefore barring them from the office, and therefore proving that they were not acting as the military, but as an insurrectionist, insurgent terrorist organization of white supremacists criminals such as the insurgents known as the KKK, which, having been an extension of the collapse of the Confederacy, having been bound to the constructs of the Lost Cause, having received payments as a sell of the right of conquest to the Soviet Union that they might destroy the United States and make it a vassal communist community to the USSR, would then materialize the function of their treachery in insurrection as rebellious insurrection, barring them from the right to the office, disqualifying them, requiring self-acting court-martials, and other barring uh, compulsions and orders and policies and procedures which inherently must be automated with the function of purging the communist insurrectionists inside of the government, who, being an extension of the white supremacist terrorist organization, the KKK, having conducted extraordinary violence in order to gain political viability, such as their eradication of an entire black town for the audacity of being wealthy, or for the function of overthrowing and murdering the North Carolina black elected leaders back in the day, being a functional insurrectionist rebellion, are not Americans and therefore engaged in the insurrection as officers are barred from the office and therefore are purged from the military or other departments, in which case they did not have any authorities, immunities, or protections concerning their activities, which were not an action of the constitutional republic of these United States. The Confederates' rebellion for the communist insurrection has at the concept of the illegal barring of David individually from the political party which he would have made, manufactured, and grown to maturity, which, as a racist position, is specifically barred. To this extent, the exponential increase on the specific violation of David actively being allowed to enter each state without any bias would by definition allow the concept of him as an identity not be a justification of the bias, and therefore the extension of the political party which would have won the elections, as proven by the retaliations by the voter fraud, would then materialize the function from the censorship, proving the substantive changes from the vote, which then materializes his position in all of these arrangements, which have added the pre-obligation as the aristocracy to have chosen um, the Senate and have actively high influence inside the rest of the elections. To wit, the insurrectionists were burdened with a quandary on what to do about that, in which case the only reasonable answer would have been providing David as dedicated to national security as the Congressional Intelligence Six-Star General, making David the top military policeman with Congress's authority over the executive, even to the position of being able to arrest or challenge the president with the authority of Congress, at which point the function, having fully barred itself, had encouraged their position of the interest of the punishment without due process from the coercion as an extortion, as retaliations for the pursuit of the remedy in order to create the alternative option to having to deal with either of those two problems. Either the aristocracy voted them out or the congressional oversight arrests the traitors, in which case the active function of Congress engaging in the investigations would have found the correct answers and would have actively purged out the disloyal throughout the government. What's the difference between David and a policeman? Everyone that David's after is a trained killer.